Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The thing about my dad is, he never once said the word proud to me, not even after I made it through college on scholarships, not even after I bought my first house without a dime of help, and sure as hell not after I stuck around while mom went through chemo. All while Luke was off chasing his next promotion in Dallas. But here I was, 38 years old, sitting in a golf club banquet hall surrounded by fake wood paneling and stale salmon canapes, watching the old man raise his glass and say, with a crooked grin, "Everything I've achieved was for you, son," as he nodded toward Luke. Everyone clapped. People actually clapped. Like this was some big, emotional moment. Luke, of course, stood up, playing it modest with that politician smile he's been perfecting since he was 16. The guy could charm a speeding ticket out of a cop, and Dad loved every damn minute of it. Mom wiped a tear. The ladies from the country club giggled like they were watching the end of a Hallmark movie. Meanwhile, I just sat there, sipping my warm Chardonnay, wondering how many people in this room would still smile if they knew what I was carrying in my jacket pocket. It was a plain white envelope. No logo, no name. Just two words in black Sharpie: Final Audit. I'd written it almost a month ago, but I'd been drafting it in my mind for the better part of 10 years. It wasn't just financials, it was a mirror, really. A carefully arranged, no bullshit reflection of everything he'd tried to hide under decades of self-made man posturing and country club righteousness. It took years of patience, combing through dusty ledgers, cross-referencing filings, watching patterns and people. If you stare at the numbers long enough, they start telling you stories. Most people just don't want to hear them. He started working in 1960 and retired after 35 years. So now, in 2025, he's done, said the MC, a portly ex-CFO named Ron, who had either flubbed the math or didn't care enough to double-check. The crowd laughed politely, but I nearly choked on my drink. I wanted to stand up right then and there, shout out the obvious error: hell, if you're gonna toast the man, at least get your damn math right. But I didn't, because that wasn't the moment. The moment was coming. Dad stepped up to the microphone with that slow, lumbering pace of his, dragging his feet just enough to remind everyone he'd earned every limp and creak. He adjusted his tie even though it was already perfect, then looked around the room with that smug, weathered confidence that said, "I built this from nothing, and you better damn well clap for it." And they did. Oh, how they clapped. Like seals trained by generations of polite obedience. "I'm not a man of many words," he started, which was hilarious considering he once gave a 40-minute toast at Luke's wedding. "But I'll say this, I built this business with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Not for me, but for my family. And most of all, for my son Luke, who'll carry on what I started." He raised his glass. To legacy. It was quiet for a beat. Then the room erupted in applause and cheers and clinking glasses. Mom dabbed at her eyes. Luke stood again, shaking his head like, "Ah, Dad," and gave him a little hug. The whole thing was so picture perfect, it made me sick to my stomach. And me? I sat there, still smiling. Not the warm, happy kind of smile, no, the kind you wear when you've just remembered exactly why you can't let things go. The kind of smile a man has when he's been quietly planning something for years, and now the stage is finally his. I stood up. My chair made a soft scrape across the hardwood floor, the kind that makes just enough noise to get people to look your way. I picked up my glass, walked to the center of the room, and raised it slowly. Every eye turned toward me, some surprised, others just mildly curious. I saw Dad furrow his brow, just for a second. He knew I wasn't the spontaneous speech type. Not unless I had a reason. I cleared my throat. "I just have one thing to add," I said, loud enough that even the caterers in the back stopped moving. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. Plain, white, quiet. A ghost of a thing. I didn't wave it around. I just walked to the front, held it out to him, and said, "You might want to read this when you get home. Or now. Up to you." His face didn't change at first. He took the envelope like he wasn't sure if it was a joke or a birthday card. Then he looked at the words written on it. Final audit. 3 seconds passed. 4. His fingers trembled, just barely. But I caught it, and in that moment, I saw something I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not annoyance. Not even suspicion. It was fear. That's when I knew I'd timed it perfectly. I nodded once slowly, then stepped back and took a long drink. The glass trembled just a little in my hand, but not from nerves. It was adrenaline. 10 years of waiting does that to a man. The room hadn't caught up yet. People were still smiling, murmuring, assuming it was some inside joke. But my mother wasn't smiling. She looked straight at me like she knew exactly what was in that envelope. And maybe she did. Dad looked down at the envelope, then up at me. His voice low, he said, "What is this?" I didn't answer. Because some questions answer themselves. There's a moment right after the truth lands when everything seems quieter than it should be, like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter. That was the silence I heard after I handed him the envelope. Not a dramatic crush or some heated reaction, but a tight pause, like the walls of that stupid banquet hall were pressing in, curious about what would happen next. He didn't open it then. No, of course he didn't. My father was too calculated for that. Too controlled. He just nodded stiffly, slid it into his suit pocket, and tried to go back to pretending it was just another toast. But I saw it in his eyes. That envelope was a ticking clock, and he had no idea how much time was left on it. Later that night, I sat in my car outside the house I grew up in, parked just far enough down the street that they wouldn't notice. All the cars were there: Luke's new Range Rover, Mom's tired Buick, Dad's Cadillac, still gleaming like it was showroom fresh. I waited for the lights to dim, then flicker on again in his office, which used to be the guest room until he got promoted and decided he needed a space to think big. That's when I knew he was reading it. Inside that envelope wasn't just a bunch of spreadsheets or boring tax codes. It was the story of every lie he thought was buried. I had spent nearly 4 years building it, little by little, number by number. Not because I needed revenge, at least not at first, but because I needed to know if I was crazy. For most of my life, people acted like I was just bitter, just jealous of my golden boy brother. And maybe I was. But bitterness doesn't make offshore money vanish or paper trails go cold. Facts don't care if your feelings are hurt. I started digging after he made Luke vice president of the family business without even telling me there was a vacancy. I was working at the same company, in accounting, running budgets, and eating lunch alone while Luke spent his afternoons golfing with suppliers and flirting with the interns. That was 5 years ago. I asked Dad why he didn't consider me for the role, and I'll never forget what he said. "You're a good numbers guy, Jake." But Luke's got leadership. Just like that. Not a conversation, not a suggestion to try harder, just a closed door with a condescending pat on the back. The thing that really set it off, though, wasn't business. It was Luke's wedding. Dad stood up at the rehearsal dinner, glass in hand, and said, "I've been waiting for this moment since Luke was a boy." I knew he'd be someone people could look up to. Then he talked for 10 minutes about football, hard work, and legacy, like he was delivering some sermon. And the only time my name came up was when he said, "Jake will handle the numbers for the honeymoon fund." I remember laughing out loud, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. So yeah, maybe I was bitter. But that bitterness became fuel. And when you fuel something long enough, it turns into fire. The audit started with harmless curiosity, just looking over the quarterly reports. But there were patterns, numbers that didn't add up, transactions that skipped the usual approval process, payments to vendors I'd never heard of. Then I started checking the archived reports from the early 2000s before I worked there full-time. That's when the red flags really started flying. Transfers to a shell corporation with a Cayman address. Reimbursements for consulting fees with no names attached. And the biggest one, a series of deposits into a personal account registered under a name I only saw once before. R.J. Callahan Holdings. My father's initials. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted proof. Cold, undeniable, by-the-book evidence. So I spent the next 18 months building the full picture. I ran back channel reports, compared old tax filings, even used a friend in the Department of Revenue to trace corporate structures anonymously. Every lead led back to him. Not the company. Not Luke. Him. Dad. And so the envelope grew fatter. It wasn't just about theft. It was betrayal. It was the man who preached about doing things the right way, skimming off his own empire, hiding behind clean ties and Sunday church attendance. Every time he shook a donor's hand, he was laundering his own image. So when he opened the envelope in his office that night, I knew the first line would hit like a gut punch. It read, "Unreported offshore accounts traced to your name, connected to client invoices from fiscal year 2011 through 2018. There were screenshots, tax code violations, wire transfers broken down by month. It was all there, wrapped in professional language and footnotes, but the message was loud and clear. I see you. I don't know what he did immediately after. I didn't need to. I'd already done my part. The match was lit. But what I didn't expect, what hit me as I drove away from the dark street, engine low, heart strangely calm, was that I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet, anyway. All I felt was this deep, strange quiet. Like the moment right before a storm breaks, when everything in the air feels too still to trust. I kept thinking of something he once told Luke during one of their backyard football talks. Real men don't flinch when it matters. I always hated that phrase. And yet, when he read that first line, his hand shook. He flinched. 3 days after the party, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, blocked. Actually, just no caller ID, which I normally wouldn't answer, but something about the timing felt deliberate. I was sitting in my kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, still waiting for the fallout from the envelope to start. I expected lawyers, maybe a board meeting, maybe a panicked call from Luke, but none of those had come yet. Just silence. Thick, humming, waiting for the hammer silence. So when the phone rang, I picked it up, half expecting it to be a scammer or maybe even Dad himself. Instead, a voice I hadn't heard in almost 10 years said, "Jake. It's Mike. We need to talk. Now." Uncle Mike wasn't really my uncle by blood, he was Dad's younger brother by 8 years, but they couldn't have been more different if they'd been raised on separate planets. Where Dad wore a tie even on Sundays and polished his shoes with religious fervor, Mike used to roll up to family barbecues in ripped jeans and Led Zeppelin t-shirts, stinking of weed and bad decisions. He disappeared after I turned 20, after some weird argument with Dad that no one ever explained. Just one day gone. Mom said he moved out west to find himself, which was her way of saying got kicked out again. He told me to meet him at a dive bar out near the state line, the kind of place with wood-paneled walls, flickering neon signs, and bartenders who didn't ask questions. He was already at a corner booth when I walked in, older than I remembered, gaunt, gray in the beard, eyes that looked like they'd seen the inside of too many regrets. He nodded once, slid a beer across the table without a word, then said, "I saw what you did at the party." He read it, didn't he? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, trying to decide if this was a trap or something else entirely. He took a long sip of his drink, leaned back, and said, "It's not the first time your dad's had something to hide, you know. I covered for him once. Back in '78. That hit me like a slap." He went on, slowly at first, like someone peeling off a scab that never quite healed right. Said that back when they were starting the company, before it even had a name, Dad had cooked the books on a construction deal. A few $100,000 went missing. A city inspector got paid off. When the heat came down, Dad was the one who was supposed to take the fall. But Mike had just gotten out of some minor legal trouble, weed possession, bar fight, something stupid, and Dad convinced him to take the hit, promising he'd pay him back, protect him, set him up once it blew over. Only it never did. I spent 14 months in county jail while your dad built his empire, he said, voice low but steady. He promised me it was just a bump, that he'd fix it. But once I was in, he changed the locks and the story. I couldn't believe it. Or maybe I could. It felt too clean, too perfectly rotten to be fake. The pattern was there: use people, then discard them when they're inconvenient. Mike was just the first casualty I never knew about. And your mom, he said, voice lowering like he was afraid she might hear him from miles away. She knew. I don't know how much, but she knew something. I caught her crying once when I got out. She handed me $5,000 in cash and said, "Don't come back." What do you think that means? I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't know. After I left the bar, I drove around for hours, just letting the anger settle into something denser, something I could carry. I kept thinking about Mom. Sweet, quiet, gentle Mom, always smoothing over Dad's edges, always making excuses, always making peace. Was that all just damage control? Or did she really believe she was protecting us? The next day, I went back to the house while they were out. I still had a key. The guest room turned office was locked, of course, and the safe was probably cleared out. But I wasn't looking for paperwork, I was looking for something older. I went into her bedroom, into the closet, where she kept her old sewing machine and dusty boxes labeled memories. One of them was a jewelry box, cheap, pink velvet with tarnished clasps and a tiny ballerina that had long since stopped spinning. Inside were old church bulletins, a broken bracelet, a couple of dried flowers pressed between envelopes, and one letter, folded, yellowed, hand-addressed in shaky cursive. My name. Jake, if you're reading this, then I failed you too. There are things I never said because I thought silence would protect you. I thought pretending everything was fine would give you a better life than the truth ever could. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I just didn't want to face the mess we made. Your father is many things, but simple isn't one of them. I'm sorry. That was it. No signature. No confession. Just a quiet, heavy apology that said more than any file ever could. I sat on her bed for almost an hour, holding that letter like it was a loaded weapon. Because maybe it was. Maybe now I had the final piece. Or maybe all I had was another reminder that every truth I uncovered came with another layer of lies. And somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I finally hit send on the encrypted email with the audit findings attached, I felt less like a man starting a fire and more like a man finally opening a window in a room that had reeked for too long. The recipients were exactly who you'd expect if you wanted to ruin a man's reputation from the inside out: the company board, a few choice stakeholders with itchy trigger fingers, the state's financial regulatory body, and of course, the IRS. I didn't sign it, didn't write a message, didn't leave a clever quote at the top like some crusader with a god complex. Just the numbers, clean and devastating, the kind of numbers that don't whisper, they scream. The fallout didn't start as an explosion. No, it started as a hum, a tremble under the floorboards. First, a board meeting was called with suspicious urgency. Then came the internal memo about a sensitive financial discrepancy, which I received like any other employee, except I knew damn well it wasn't a discrepancy, it was a reckoning. 2 days after that, Luke was called into a closed-door session and didn't come out for over 3 hours. When he did, he didn't look at anyone, just grabbed his coat and walked straight past his secretary like the building was on fire, and he was the only one who smelled the smoke. The official word was suspension pending investigation, but unofficially it was exile. And I wasn't surprised, not because Luke had done anything, but because guilt is contagious in families like ours. If Dad was the king, then Luke had always been the prince who never asked questions about how the crown got made. Now he was the first casualty, and you could almost hear the quiet scrambling behind closed doors, people distancing themselves from Richard Callahan, trying to decide whether loyalty was worth sinking with the ship. It didn't take long for the lawyer to jump ship. Some tall, tight-lipped corporate fixer named Wallace, who always wore cufflinks and used too much cologne. I knew him from a few board meetings over the years, and he never looked at me like I belonged in the room. But apparently even Wallace had a line he wouldn't cross, because by the end of the week, he'd resigned effective immediately, citing a fundamental breakdown in client transparency. Which is lawyer speak for this guy lied to me, and now I'm not going down with him. I didn't expect Mom to show up at my house. She knocked once, soft like she always did, and when I opened the door, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, not physically, but emotionally, like the armor she wore for 40 years had finally cracked and all that was left was raw skin and nerves. She didn't even wait for me to offer her a seat before she said, "You have to stop this, Jake. Please." I didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorway while she kept going, her voice tight and breathless, like every word hurt coming out. "You made your point," she said. "You proved you were right, okay? He's paying for what he did. But Luke didn't know. He doesn't deserve this." I wanted to ask her if she really believed that, if she truly thought Luke was just some innocent bystander riding the coattails of a corrupt legacy, or if she was just trying to salvage what little she could before everything collapsed. But I didn't ask. I just shook my head and said, "This isn't about Luke. It's about accountability. And it's about time someone showed him what that actually looks like." That night, Luke showed up at my door. No warning, no text. Just his fist hitting the wood like he had something to prove, like he still thought this was some misunderstanding we could clear up with a beer and a backpat apology. I opened the door and saw the look on his face, somewhere between furious and betrayed, which made sense, since he was finally feeling what I'd felt for most of my life. "You could have just come to me, man," he said, hands on his hips, voice trembling like he was trying real hard not to scream. "You didn't have to burn it all down." I stared at him for a long second before answering, letting the weight of every skipped dinner, every closed-door meeting, every nod he got while I got the grunt work sink in. Then I said, "You never looked behind you, Luke. Why would you start now?" He looked stunned for a moment. Like that line hit harder than he expected. Maybe because it was the truth. Or maybe because deep down, he knew I was right. He didn't reply. Just stood there in the cold, mouth slightly open, like he had more to say but couldn't get the words to cooperate. So I gave him one last gift. A little heads up. "Check your retirement fund tomorrow," I said, turning back toward the door. "You're not as untouchable as you thought." And with that, I shut the door on the only family I had left. The silence that followed was different this time, not tense or expectant, but final. The kind of silence that means something is finally broken beyond repair. It was a Tuesday when the call came in, one of those bleak, gray mornings where even the sunlight seemed disinterested in showing up. The voice on the other end was clipped and formal. "Your father's had a stroke," she said. "He's stable, but it's serious." I didn't ask how bad, because that kind of question feels polite but useless. What does it even mean when someone like Richard Callahan goes from invincible to bedridden in a single heartbeat? After all the years of watching him bulldoze through people, decisions, and obligations without a single pause, the idea of him lying still in a hospital bed felt like some cruel joke life was finally playing back at him. I didn't rush. I didn't throw on my coat in a panic or skip traffic lights or clutch the steering wheel like the movies tell you you're supposed to. I took my time, got coffee, drove the speed limit, parked in the visitor section farthest from the entrance. I wasn't going there for him. I was going because something inside me needed to see it, needed the visual confirmation that yes, the man who raised me on judgment and silence had finally been brought down by something he couldn't control or negotiate with. His body had done what no boardroom or bank ever could. It told him enough. He was asleep when I walked in, or unconscious. I wasn't sure which. There were tubes, machines, a heart monitor with its steady digital blip that somehow made the room feel even quieter. He looked smaller. Not physically, his frame was still broad, still carried that built-in arrogance, but there was something about the way he lay there that stripped him of all the force he used to take up space. Like a curtain had been pulled back, and the wizard was just a tired old man after all. I sat down beside the bed, hands clasped, the way people do when they're pretending they're not angry. I stared at his face, waiting for some rush of emotion to hit me, pity, grief, maybe even guilt, but there was nothing. Just a low thrum of something that might have been relief, or maybe just emptiness disguised as peace. I didn't destroy you, Dad, I said quietly, not bothering to check if he could hear me. I just showed them who you really were. They did the rest. The truth hung in the air like smoke after a fire. That was always the trick, wasn't it? He never got his hands dirty directly. He let others do the cleaning, the covering, the bleeding. He just orchestrated it all from a distance, with that smug sense of nobility he wore like a second skin. And now he was reduced to this, a half-lit man in a dim room, waiting for judgment from something he couldn't buy off. Later that evening, after I left the hospital, I pulled the letter out again, the one from Mom I'd found in her old jewelry box. I'd read it a dozen times, but there was a line I hadn't really paid attention to until now, something that kept echoing louder every time I tried to forget it. She wrote, "You always saw more than you admitted, Jake. I know you did. You knew something was wrong years ago, and you chose silence, just like I did." It hit me harder than I expected, because she was right. I had known. Maybe not everything, not the full scope of his corruption, but enough. I saw the inconsistencies, the way Luke kept getting promoted without earning it, the way Dad shut down questions with a glare and a single word. I could have exposed it all sooner, but I didn't. I let it fester. I let it rot. And deep down, I think I wanted it to because I needed it to grow large enough that when I finally ripped it apart, there'd be no chance of survival. That's not justice. That's a slow kill. And maybe that makes me just as complicit. Back home, I found the old watch Dad used to wear when I was a kid, the one he'd polish every Saturday like it was sacred. He'd once told me it was his father's, said it still ticked better than anything digital. I found it in a drawer with some cufflinks and a tie pin I'd never seen him wear. I held it in my hand, turned it over, wound it slowly. It still worked. Of course it did. Some things outlast even the worst of us. I sat in the living room for a long time after that, holding the watch, listening to it tick. Just me, the sound of time, and a silence so thick it felt like company. "I became you," I whispered into the quiet. Didn't I? And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. That after all the plans, all the revenge, all the uncovering, I didn't escape him. I became a mirror of everything I hated. The control, the pride, the obsession with being right, even if it burned everything else to the ground. I got everything I ever wanted, and I've never felt emptier. There was a family photo on the shelf, one of the few left after Mom passed, after Luke stopped calling, after the business was sold for scraps under the weight of lawsuits and whispers. It showed all of us at the lake, smiling like we were whole, like the cracks weren't already forming beneath our feet. I picked it up, looked at it one last time. Then quietly, carefully, I tore it in half.